Welcome to the Human Experience Podcast, the only podcast designed to fuse your left and right brain hemispheres and feed it the most entertaining and mentally engaging topics on the planet. As we approach our ascent, please make sure your frontal, temporal and occipital lobes are in their full upright position. As you take your seat of consciousness, relax your senses and allow us to take you on a journey. We are the Intimate Strangers. Thank you for listening.
Why do I listen to the Human Experience podcast? The most easy and most perhaps cop-out answer I can give right off the bat is that my life is my own human experience. So already the title is relatable. So then you start listening, or I start listening, and I'm hearing about things that aren't really talked about. And subjects that don't quite come up because they're considered, I don't know, what's the word, taboo, perhaps? Especially from where I'm from. I'm from Texas, and not to hate on Texas, but I'm surrounded by a lot of people who are, how do I say, not everyone is as open-minded. Any podcast that encourages you to be open-minded, in my opinion, is a positive thing. The other thing I really enjoy is that no matter what the subject matter is, the conversation is always captivating to listen to. I try to find podcasts that are very easy to understand and easy to listen to, but not so easy that it's like they're dumbing it down for me. And I think this podcast has a very fine balance of that. The interviews and the subject matter are stimulating, and they're things I didn't really know about. So I find myself learning an immense amount, but it's not straining, it's not draining, it doesn't make me exhausted. And to be honest, when I am working all day and I have to spend, 2 hours a day in traffic, maybe 3, I don't want to be drained even more by something that I'm choosing to listen to. I can be passive and just listen to these two people connecting and maybe disconnecting sometimes, but at the end of it all, it's a positive experience, it's stimulating, and my ears enjoy it. So really, what I'm trying to say is that there's no reason not to listen to this podcast. So why not just listen? And if you're a human and you have experiences and you want to have more transcendent experiences, I think the human experience is giving the tools that people could need. If you're at the human experience, I just want you to know you guys are awesome, you rock, and keep doing what you're doing.
This is just a testament to our commitment to bring you guys the life-changing stuff that will affect your life in a positive way. And, my deepest, most grateful, heart-melting thanks to Hannelore, who submitted this for us. And wow, what a huge testament to everything we're doing here. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this little blurb of her telling us why she listens to HXP, and it motivates you to become a member of what we're doing. Thanks, guys. What's up, guys? Xavier Katana here, and this is our episode with Jamie Wheal of the Flow Genome Project. The book is called Stealing Fire: How Silicon Valley, the Navy SEALs, and maverick scientists are revolutionizing the way we live and work. And we get into so many different aspects of just human biology and how to get into flow state. So much of just information. You're probably gonna want to listen to this more than once, just because Jamie, when you put him on a track, he just runs with it, which I loved. I was just steering the wheel, and Jamie did really well, and we crushed this interview. So definitely pick up a copy of this book. Get to the Human XP/members for the members content part. We get into some personal stuff between Jamie and Steven, how they work together. You're going to want to hear that. Thank you guys so much for listening. The Human Experience is in session. My guest today is Mr. Jamie Wheal. Jamie, it's an honor, sir. Welcome to HXP.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jamie, the book is called Stealing Fire, and we've had your partner in crime, Steven Kotler, on. Tell us about your background and how you got into this book and, more about you.
Sure. Well, I mean, the book itself is really about this underground revolution in hacking states of consciousness and performance that's sort of happening all around the world right now in some of the most elite and well-known organizations we've all heard of, and no one's really telling that story. And the way that Stephen and I sort of stumbled on to this revolution really was because of our work as co-founders of the Flow Genome Project, which is an organization dedicated to the research and training of optimum human performance, those moments of flow or being in the zone where, sort of self-awareness drops away, we get dropped into the present moment, and typically our performance and our satisfaction with that performance just goes off the charts. And we had found ourselves working with some, true, blessed to be with some of the sort of the 1% of the 1%. And that was everyone from special operations community in the military to the U.S. Naval War College to professional extreme athletes to folks working in Fortune 100 companies at the executive level, engineering teams, solving hard problems, big five consulting firms. So basically anybody who was looking to go from A to A++. In doing that, we had really taken a fairly deep dive. There had been a lot of work in the 70s and 80s and even 90s on the psychology of being in flow states. And that was largely pioneered by Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and others. But it was, how do these states make us feel? What does it feel like when we're in them? What does it feel like when we're not in them? And in the last decade or so, there's been this sort of concomitant rise in neurobiology, the ability to measure what's happening, not just report how it feels. And so really, I would suggest that probably our biggest contribution to the field has been integrating those two things, the neurobiology under the hood and the psychology of peak performance. And that sort of leaves us with more tools. But what we didn't realize we had assembled was a sort of accidental Rosetta Stone that let us translate a whole host of additional non-ordinary experiences. And what I mean by that is that when we would be working with these organizations and saying, hey, here's flow and here's peak performance and here's how you presumably get more of it, folks were coming up to us after those conversations. They were, following up with phone calls or after dinner or a few beers and say, hey, by the way, I'm trying this other thing. I'm going on an extended 9-day Vipassana retreat. Or I'm doing, Wim Hof breathing methods in ice baths, or I'm zapping my brain with electrodes, or I'm stacking off prescription pharmaceuticals, or my engineering team is microdosing psychedelics, or I've just come back from this meditation and sexuality retreat. Is that flow? And so we were sort of torn because we were like, well, we totally get what you're saying. You are creating a non-ordinary state by these things you're doing. It appears to be valuable and useful. But we were sort of in this quandary where, like, either we were going to stretch the working definition of flow so far that none of the academics who helped develop the field would ever recognize it, or we had to come up with a bigger tent, a little bit like Roy Scheider and Jaws. Like, we're going to need a bigger boat. So the bigger boat, we thought of, we're like, okay, now what should we call all this? Because, bless their hearts, the kind of baby boomer hippie generation really did kind of run some of this terminology and these concepts into the ground. Right. So most of their languaging was kind of loaded with baggage. So we're like, all right, we got to rewind the clock all the way back to word origins. Let's go back to the ancient Greeks. And the best term that we found to kind of encompass this stuff neutrally was ecstasis. And the literal translation of that is to move out of oneself. And we thought, all right, so it's the antecedent of the word ecstasy and a lot of terms we're familiar with. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of like just kind of getting it back to that kind of value neutral term, those states or experiences that take us outside of ourselves. Now we had a big enough tent. Now we could look at all these non-ordinary states of consciousness, and that Rosetta Stone piece, which was, hey, here's the neurobiology underneath the psychology. Let us say, wow, a lot of these things, I mean, think about everything as strange as a soccer mom who's got a Kundalini yoga practice and is reading 50 Shades of Grey on her lunch break on her Kindle, right? Who's basically looking to hack kinky sex. And there's tons of research from the Netherlands and from elsewhere on the flow state experiences and the neurochemical shifts of those practices, right? All the way to biohacking CrossFitters, drinking bulletproof coffee and zapping themselves, all the way to hedge fund traders, right, using magnetic stimulation to military operations guys using float tanks, right, to the engineers microdosing, all these things. We're like, oh, you guys are actually you're shared conspirators in an underground revolution in consciousness, and you wouldn't even recognize each other walking down the street. In fact, so many of you are in these subcultures that never the twain shall meet, that you guys would swear blind that you would never engage in half of the practices or behaviors or customs of these other sub-tribes, but you roll them all together with that Rosetta Stone kind of decoder ring, and we're like, oh, God, this is everywhere, and no one's talking about it.
That's really truly fascinating, and there's so much of my life where I'm talking about this with my friends and the people that I encounter about flow state. So, let's define this for the people who are listening. How do we define being in a flow state?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's almost, like a lot of the kind of ancient wisdom traditions, it can almost be as helpful to define it by negation, by what it's not. And what flow states and all of these non-ordinary states that we talk about in the book aren't is 21st century Western normal. And 21st century Western normal, tired, wired, stressed, right, has a really consistent signature for all of us. And it's, generally speaking, our brain is cranking along in fairly fast-moving beta waves, which are, generally congruent with activity in our prefrontal cortex and our executive functioning self, meaning who I think I am. So my biography, who I am behind my eyes, that storytelling, meaning-making machine, along with my ability to think about my thinking, delay gratification, engage in abstract reasoning, long-term planning, all those kind of things that make us the clever monkeys we are. So that's going on. Now, the challenge is that as we've evolved that capacity over the last 1,000 years, but on turbocharge, really since the French Enlightenment. You've got René Descartes saying, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, the era of the rational individual. We've really amped that up to the point of almost to the breaking point. And in fact, there's some arguments that self-awareness has done all sorts of great things for us, right? It's given us the scientific revolution. It's given us democratic revolution. It's given us the evolution of civil rights and free market democracy and capitalism, all sorts of amazing breakthroughs. But the one glitch was that we forgot to build an off switch. And so we've become trapped in this hyper-aware, self-referential self-consciousness. And that experience is actually incredibly stressful. So to be a monkey, right, dodging the saber-toothed tiger, right, if I'm away from a threat, I'm back to being a monkey. I'm living large. But to be a human, aware that I'm that monkey, and then I'm here for a brief moment, and then I die, and the universe is vast and devours my significance in a gulp, that's a sumbitch, right? And so typically, the kinds of fight or flight responses that are baked into us, they're evolutionarily imprinted. We get norepinephrine, we get a shot of adrenaline, we get cortisol, which, all these things do great stuff for us in momentary threats, right? They shunt blood from the extremities, they increase our heart rate, they dilate our pupils, they give us better peripheral vision, they heighten our reaction time, they leave us ready to live and survive for another day. But in 21st century Western normal, that's the conversation I'm having while stuck in traffic for an hour and a half, rehashing a conversation with my pathological boss. That's the conversation I'm having at 3 a.m. when I can't sleep, and I'm going over a fight that was unresolved with my spouse from the day before, right? And that steady drip, drip, drip of that fight or flight arousal with no place to put it and no way to turn it off, that's what's killing us. And so, anxiety, 1 in 4 of us, at least in the United States, are on psychiatric medication. That's 25% of us that are basically saying, I am so out of whack, I am going to take a pharmaceutical that's expensive, has abundant side effects, only works marginally, just as a shot of rolling the dice to change this channel. So that's what it isn't. Right, is 21st century normal, and most of us are stuck there. We've only got one channel to choose from. But these non-ordinary states, of which flow is one of the most easy and ubiquitous to access, all that changes. And so instead of an overactive prefrontal cortex with a hyperactive inner critic, second guessing and commenting on everything, our brain tends to quieten down. That part of our brain shuts off and ceases to be as active. Our brain waves, that executive function, firing along, solving problems, slows down. into a more relaxed alpha, kind of alert, perceiving, but not necessarily thinking specifically about any one thing, all the way down to theta, which is almost more kind of dreamy, quasi-hypnotic, that kind of state we get just as we're drifting off into sleep, right? Our stress chemicals, like nitric oxide, is in our bloodstream. It's a neurotransmitter. It flushes away the stress chemicals. Our heart rate slows down. We replace stress and fight or flight chemicals with feeling, feel good and learning and reward chemicals like dopamine, saying, yes, this is important, pay attention. Endorphins, which ease pain and create mild to moderate euphoria. Those are basically the internal equivalent of opioids or morphine. Anandamide, which is the equivalent of a cannabinoid, which again eases pain. People used to think that runner's high was all about endorphins. Researchers now think it has as much to do, if not more, with anandamide. So it's a pain or bliss producer and prompts more lateral connections between unusual subjects. And then if you're doing it in conjunction with others, there's often an additional release of oxytocin, pair bonding, trust, intimacy, as well as serotonin. And the serotonin system is infinitely complex, but in a minimum can relate to increased feelings of well-being and sort of satisfaction. So that is what happens remarkably consistently in a whole suite of these non-ordinary states, what we've been calling ecstasis. Flow states are one of them. Meditation and mystical states, and then finally psychedelic states, those that are pharmacologically primed. And there's obviously, if people have been sort of reading that, you can't really get away from the recent research on the psychedelic renaissance, the work at Johns Hopkins, NYU, College of London, everywhere else. And so all those bundled together, there's tons of press coverage about each of these verticals. But the piece that's been missing, and the piece that we really hope to communicate in this book is, there's actually a bigger thing going on. It matters less which of these doors you step through than it does the actual state, the space, the experience, and the benefits of once you step through that door into this shared terrain.
Yeah, I love it. When I was in LA and just interviewing various people there, there was this sort of subculture of people who were paying attention to this work that you guys were doing at the Flow Genome Project. And what would you say is the noticeable kind of similarity between these people who are high performance, engineers, people who are looking for this kind of thrill, and these Navy SEALs, and then these sort of soccer moms that are reading 50 Shades, as you said earlier? Like, where do you see the similarity between these people? Are we inherently looking for this sort of flow state in ourselves?
Yeah, interestingly enough, we were teaching at the Esalen Institute up in Big Sur a couple of years ago, and there was a woman. She was, a sort of soccer mom on steroids from down in San Diego. She came up and she was describing how she'd come to our work and flow in general, and she was also like a CrossFit nut. And she sort of confessed, and that was actually one of the data points that kind of became the seeds of this book. Because she was describing, like, I do CrossFit because yes, I was an athlete in college, blah blah blah, but she did it to get her fix. She did it because it was the only way she was able to basically work herself into exercise-induced flow and be absent the pains and discomforts of an unhappy marriage. And I was like, oh wow! And she was a little concerned by it. She's like, I feel this is a little addictive. I feel right. This is maybe not the most balanced way, but it's the best thing I've got right now. So Bron Siegel, a professor at UCLA, has made a case that, birds do it, bees do it, educated fleas do it, right? The idea that the drive to shift consciousness is pervasive throughout the animal kingdom. And that's everything from, elephants raiding breweries or drinking from fermented mud holes to reindeer eating, Amanita muscaria mushrooms, to baboons guzzling iboga, psychedelic root from Africa. Like basically, all animals do it, including primates and humans. And so he makes the case that because you would think that like getting twisted as far as being an animal is probably not the best evolutionary strategy. You're going to get picked off like a sitting duck, right? So the question is why wasn't this behavior aberrant and just edited out of the gene pool really quickly? Yeah. And so he and psychologist Edward de Bono and others have advanced the notion that, hey, what it serves, it gets us out of ruts. The ability to shift our consciousness from waking state, again, fight or flight routine, into something novel, into those eureka moments, those aha moments, the your chocolate and my peanut butter moments, the here's the silly putty or the slinky or the post-it note idea, right? Those lateral leaps of de-patterning introduce novelty into first our brains and minds, and then into our culture and our artifacts, and that is a positive thing. So Siegel makes the case, hey, this desire to shift states of consciousness is actually arguably our fourth evolutionary drive, sort of behind only food, water, and sex. And so once you realize that, you ask, well, what unites all of these folks, these crazy little sub-tribes? Flow has been the domain of artists and athletes, and meditation has been the domain of kind of saints and mystics, and psychedelics have been the domain of hippies and ravers, and never the three shall meet. Yeah. But what it does unite them is our shared humanity and that fourth evolutionary drive, that yearning for something more than 21st century normal. And you can, 50 Shades of Grey, we were kind of joking about it, but it's actually an incredibly good test case because, and anybody who even read a paragraph of that book could realize it was doggerel verse. It was not within a country mile of a work of literature. And yet that book sold more copies than the entire 7-volume series of Harry Potter combined.
Wow.
So that's a true what the fuck moment. You're like, seriously? Like, how is that possible? There's no correlation between quality. There's no character development. There's no profound message, right? This is a poorly written bit of Harlequin romance about mediocrely told BDSM from a woman who's clearly never experienced any of it. And it was off the charts. So you think, okay, so what is it, right? And so you can make a case that all of that repressed suburban femininity and womanhood, right? Women who were clearly undersatisfied in their full erotic expression, were reading that book and going, yes, here, just intuitively, here is the path to something more. And if you compare that to like electronic dance music is another great example where EDM music these days, in fact, Tomorrowland, which is a festival in the Netherlands, just went on sale this week. It sold out in, I think, 50 minutes. And it plays 2 weekends, and it's hundreds of thousands of tickets. And it sold out in minutes, 6 months ahead of being offered. And you're like, okay, well, that's interesting, because why do most folks go to concerts? Well, they really have they have a crush on one of the band members, or they love the story, like the Beatles or Bruce Springsteen. They love the songs and the lyrics. They all love to be there with their friends, arm in arm. There's some communal bonding moment. Well, in EDM, there's some dude in a hoodie with a laptop. And he presses play and then pumps his hand in the air at the drops. That's kind of it, right? And you've got, and so there's no music, there's no lyrics, there's no band and personalities. There's, strip out 70% of everything that people used to go to see live music for. And you're like, well, what is there instead? And not unlike 50 Shades of Grey, what there is highly concentrated state-shifting technology. You have these high-end, high-fidelity sound stacks, often function one sound systems that separate highs, lows, and middles in a way that like ceases to be just listening to music. It's basically like going to a sonic car wash and standing in front of a sort of acoustic water pick. You're just getting your body rearranged by sound waves. And there's lasers, and there's typically lots of mind-bending substances, and there's this great crowd entrainment of 250,000 people at a time losing their mind and dropping into something else together. And that is now worth 48% of the entire ticket sales on the planet right now.
Yeah.
You got private equity guys, you got Wall Street guys, they're all piling money into these things because they're realizing, oh, wow, state-changing technologies is what's up right now. Everybody is moving beyond from experience economy stuff like Starbucks or Cheesecake Factory or Cabela's outdoor stores, into transformation economy stuff. If you can help me become someone I wasn't at the beginning of this experience, the margin I'm willing to pay you is off the charts.
Yeah, it's so profound. I mean, when you're studying these sort of spiritual renaissances of, these awakening ideas of electronic dance music and these women who are kind of obsessed with this book because this desire that it creates in them or more, have you noticed that because we live in such a connected age that it made your research easier or more accessible?
Well, one of the things we noticed is we kept running into the same people around the world. And that was kind of another one of the big sort of like pause and really just like, let's just gut check. Are we seeing what we think we're seeing? So, there is, and I'll say this with all self-awareness that this sounds hyperbolic, but there is fundamentally an underground initiate brotherhood of tech-nomadic glitterati, alpha hippies. And they go from everything from Davos and TED to Coachella and South by and Burning Man. They're hanging out at these high-end gatherings. They are mostly globally mobile, in either running companies, founding companies, post-liquidity events. They're living a large life, and plug into these repeated initiatory experiences with each other, and then go back and seed culture with it. I mean, that was, we were invited to speak at the TEDx event at Burning Man a couple of years ago, and then got to participate in kind of this salon with some of the founders. And at the time, they were wondering if and how they were going to purchase a permanent chunk of land to host Burning Man culture and events. And Larry Page and Sergey Brin and Elon Musk and lots of Tony Hsieh and lots of other people were involved. But at this gathering were, partners from Goldman Sachs, heads of the World Economic Forum, the CEO of the largest ad agency on the planet. People, you're like, wait a second, this is way past just Silicon Valley freaks and misfits trucking out, for a weekend in the desert. This is a globally connected bunch of folks from the Pentagon, like major players. And they are literally coming together to share what you could make a case is a sort of modern day rite of Eleusis, right? A modern day initiatory mystery cult. And people are having these experiences. They are impacting their personal lives deeply, but also impacting their professional lives and creating this kind of just below the waterline network of initiates that sort of know each other with a nod and a wink and a secret handshake. And they're moving money, they're moving capital, they're moving talent, they're moving IP, they're creating new companies, they're creating new partnerships. And this is kind of the new way that businesses gets done. I mean, it's like the Masons and the Elks Lodges are done and over with, are pretty much dead on arrival. And what's emerging now is we're just seeing this, as I said, just this sort of tech-nomadic glitterati, these folks that are sharing in this experience. It creates high trust, high intimacy, and a shared degree of inspiration coming from similar sources. And that arguably is one of the most driving forces seeding culture these days. And no one's really talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are now, right? And
Yeah.
I mean, it's really great because you're researching, creativity, consciousness, and this is what I love to talk about. I love to just explore this idea of, being more connected to ourselves, getting into this sort of flow state. It blows me away the research that you guys have come up with, and I'm paging through your book now, and something that you bring up is Alexander Shuglin.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how many of our listeners know who he is. Can you give us an idea of how impactful Sasha's work was for, psychedelics and our awareness?
Sure. So Sasha just died, I suppose, a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago now. So this may be one of the first sort of monograph treatment / hat tips to him and his legacy, and certainly, with full appreciation and respect from our end on that. Sasha was a boy genius. He was admitted to Harvard on a full scholarship, I think, at the age of 15. He then dropped out to join the Navy right after World War II, ended up being a young sort of wunderkind chemist for Dow Chem. He, within a few years, invented one of the first biodegradable pesticides, which made them gajillions of dollars and effectively gave him a blank slate to do whatever the hell he wanted afterwards. And he basically became fascinated with the compound mescaline, which is a psychoactive. It's prevalent in San Pedro cactuses, which you can get at landscaping stores or Home Depots if you want. But I mean, he had extracted it. He's like, wow, this one little tiny molecule completely changed my life. This was also what Aldous Huxley wrote about in The Doors of Perception. And Sasha was like, hey, if that's possible, and because obviously he had mad skills in the chem lab, he's like, well, what if I just tweak a little hydrogen bond? What if I just tweak a little carbon chain? And he began modifying these compounds. And so just to give you perspective, by the 1950s, I think there were 20 to 30 known psychedelic, psychoactive kind of compounds, ones that truly had a mind-impacting effect. And by the time he had completed his research, there was something like 250.
Yeah.
And the one that he's most well known for is not the discovery of MDMA, or what is commonly known as ecstasy or Molly, but he revived it. It was originally developed by Merck in Germany back in the teens or 20s, and he just resurfaced it, began experimenting with it, and realized, oh wow. And this was before it was called ecstasy. It was, at the time, it was called empathy. I mean, it was available during the 60s. The hippies just weren't interested in it, which is, I think, another kind of interesting thing as far as cultural timing and that kind of stuff, as was DMT, which is another psychedelic that has received all sorts of attention lately. But the hippies had access to all this stuff, and they didn't pick them, which I think, again, if you overlay anthropology and culture onto pharmacology, you realize, oh, a lot of this stuff's been rattling around. But Sasha found it, was like, hey, this really does increase feeling, because it interacts with the serotonin system. It tends to increase feelings of safety, security, well-being, belonging, and it can act as a profound sort of opener for psychotherapeutic processing. And being a highly credentialed professional that he was, he turned on some of his psychiatrist and psychotherapist friends and said, hey, you may want to consider conducting therapy with this compound as an adjunct, which they did. And there became this kind of underground movement that was, considerably not unlike the 1950s, 60s use of LSD in psychotherapy, where Cary Grant and Jack Nicholson and a lot of folks, if anybody saw Mad Men and saw those episodes, that was how it was, right? It wasn't freaks and misfits, at Woodstock that got this started. This was high-end intelligentsia, sharing the keys to the kingdom. And so Sasha popularized it, and then it kind of leaked out. And by the time everyone else knows the rest of the story, by the time the early 80s in Dallas and elsewhere, it became kind of a club drug and all those kind of things, and then got shut down. But Sasha was one of the ones to really popularize it. But interestingly, he was working for the DEA the whole time. And so he won awards for publishing the best law enforcement chemical resource book, to date. So the DEA he was constantly serving as an expert witness and testifying and doing all kinds of stuff. He was the subject matter expert, in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Then they were like, hey, wait a second, man, you're kind of getting a little out of hand. And he's like, okay, I need to get this information out. And so he published 2 books, which were sort of 50-50, these chemical love stories between him and his wife, Anne, like their adventures and explorations, discovery. That was really what sort of cemented his place in countercultural lore, because he took a stand for open sourcing ecstasis. He said, look, these compounds are human birthrights. They shouldn't be locked down or patented or owned or sanctioned. Humans have a right for them. All the way to today, where we now have 3D printers with as little as vegetable oil and paraffin wax. You can punch in the coding for any compound you want and spit out on the other side, right, whatever molecule you're interested in fabricating. So we've gone from Sasha doing these, what bioassays, which is just a fancy way of saying do it yourself and take notes, to open sourcing the cookbooks, to now totally democratized means of production, where anybody anywhere with a Wi-Fi and a 110 volt outlet can fabricate whatever molecules they're interested in exploring.
That's amazing. That's so profound. I find that's we're in the age of this new Enlightenment era that I don't think humanity's ever seen before. And, it blows me away. And the reason that I brought up Alexander Shuglin was because I wanted to get into these Silicon Valley architects taking low doses of LSD to solve complex problems. Can you talk about that a bit, please?
Yeah, sure. And then I also want to make sure we kind of get to like the stakes of the game as well. So if we can kind of put a pin in that.
Sure.
I feel like that's critical versus just sort of like feel-good boosterism.
Of course.
But in a sense, right? And this started with James Fadiman way back in the 60s. If anybody's been following the current kind of microdosing trend, in fact, Ayelet Waldman's just come out with her book about her microdosing on LSD for a month. So that's kind of everywhere in the New York Times and the New Yorker and elsewhere. But fundamentally, there's been this idea that there's sort of the macrodose. Again, that's what the stereotypically the hippies did, like just hook down as much as you possibly can, blast off to the back and beyond, see what happens, cross your fingers, hope for the best. Right. And the opposite of microdosing has also got potentially, arguably, even a more interesting history, which is what happens when you take sub-perceptual threshold amounts of these things. And the sub-perceptual means the walls don't melt, I don't have any visual distortions, I may not even have any subjective emotional noticeable differences, but other than just greater cognitive acuity. And so way back in the 60s, he took a bunch of engineers from HP and Stanford and elsewhere and said, okay, the sole criteria to enter this experiment is 6 months you've been working on a hard engineering or technical problem you haven't been able to solve. Come on in. We're going to give you microdoses of LSD or mescaline, depending on the control group, and then see how you do, still going back and trying to solve those problems. And they ended up with something like 9 patentable or fundable breakthroughs in devices, including complex stuff, linear gate accelerators and photon measurements, and really high-end, high-tech stuff. And most people reported somewhere around 180 to 220% increase in performance, acuity, and lateral problem solving. He that all went underground. It got completely shut down for 4 decades. He has been lately, he's been doing a crowdsourced kind of clandestine approach where he's basically saying, here's the protocols, do them if you want, write back in anonymously, and we'll share the results. And they got over 400 people having done it today. And again, similar results over, the majority of people saying, I have better access to lateral pattern recognition problem solving, and the ability to generate insights via new ideas. And if you combine what Fadiman's been doing, which is largely just, hey, this is a crowdsourced experiment, let me just aggregate the information, the feedback. If you take a look at what Robin Carhart-Harris is doing over the Imperial College of London, then you really see something interesting. You start understanding the mechanism of actions behind it all. Because what he was doing is he started his graduate work interested in studying the subconscious, a kind of Jungian analysis, what the hell's going on under there, that kind of thing. And he was really limited to basically blunt instrument tools, self-reporting, dream analysis, slips of the tongue, all the things that would suggest there's something else to me than what I'm trying to manage up front, right? And he was really underwhelmed by this. Like, man, this is some clunky-ass tools to try and plot the deepest depths of our minds. So that's when he first got turned on to, hey, what if we start using pharmacological priming, specifically MDMA and LSD and psilocybin, so that we can then put someone in a complex medical measurement device like an fMRI, which measures blood flow and magnetic activity through the brain, and then we see what's going on in our subconscious a little bit more reliably. So what he found was that our self is not simply, it doesn't just live in one place, including the prefrontal cortex that we talked about earlier. It's not a sole location that houses me, right? Rather, our self is this loosely strung together network of nodes throughout our brain. And that just like in kind of Star Wars, right? If you knock down even 1 or 2 of those nodes, the whole grid collapses. So that ego disintegration that is often talked about in meditative experiences, psychedelic experiences, flow states, is a pretty apt metaphor that our sense of self can literally disintegrate when a couple of the nodes are knocked out via whatever mechanism. Could be, hyperventilation and breathing practices, could be psychedelics, et cetera. And he also discovered something else, which is under the influence of these psychedelics, what is happening is that you are getting disparate and far-flung connections, not just, I've connected idea A to idea B, but rather zone A of my brain is connecting to zone C, D, and E of my brain. Yeah. And they're now talking to each other in ways that they don't under normal waking states. So to loop this all back together, you've got Fadiman way back in the 60s, starting with this microdosing, coming to now and then being in conjunction with some of the neurobiological measurements like Carhart-Harris is doing in London. And really, one of the most interesting things is an awful lot of this has to do with our serotonin systems and our serotonin receptors. So psilocybin, LSD, and serotonin were all getting deeply studied in the 50s and 60s, right? Then came the federal lockdown on all psychedelic research in the 60s, and then really and truly in the early 70s. And basically, all research on the serotonin system got crunched down to SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, Prozac, Zoloft, et cetera. So we got these weak-ass drugs with tons of side effects that only work in a handful of people and pound you with complications for months and years afterwards. And they only work as long as you're actively taking them. And they cost a bundle, and by the way, they're patented, right? So that's what we got out of the serotonin system for the last 4 decades. We got Prozac Nation. Yeah. And instead, what we're seeing now is a resurgence in access to and information on a bunch of other substances that interact with our serotonin system in arguably far higher impact, far lower side effect, lower consequence kind of ways, which is the antithesis of the social story, the antithesis of the PTA moms talking about stamps getting passed out to kids, or somebody who thought he was a banana and ends up in an insane asylum. We're like, oh no, this is all serotonin system shit, and it's super interesting and beneficial, and just in time because there's a bunch of really depressed, anxious, unhappy folks these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned this earlier. You said something about a psychedelic renaissance. There does seem to be this sort of trend happening with, you look at MAPS and the work they're doing and the way they're moving into, like, I think they're in phase 3 or 4 trials of MDMA, and they're aiming to have MDMA legal to where you can get it prescribed by your doctor, and you're suffering from PTSD or depression, and you go to your doctor and you ask for this, and finally these doors are kind of opening for us. I feel like our consciousness collectively has been kind of held back. Is that the right word? Would you use a similar word?
Yeah, I mean, I would. We talk about in the book the idea of just there are state-sanctioned states of consciousness, and they persist. There are certain states and there are certain access points to those states that are reinforced and endorsed despite the evidence, and there are others that are actively repressed and suppressed despite the evidence. And we are entering a place of, an open source revolution where we have access not only to the keys to our cage, but the keys to the kingdom.
You have been listening to The Human Experience, and that was our guest, Mr. Jamie Wheal. You definitely want to hear the rest of this interview along with the other content that we have on the member side. Get to thehumanxp.com/members. It's under construction, but it will be available eventually. Pre-order your spot now at this discounted price, and you can hear all of the content that we're providing for you. This is the way that we're able to keep the show running and keep the show alive for you guys, and make the content special enough, and we really go out of our way to do that. So hopefully you believe in us enough to support our work and what we're doing here. Thank you guys so much for listening, and see you guys next week.